You are listening to Viewpoints from PlaceCloud. Cultural researchers tell stories of places from around the world. For the full multimedia experience and to support the creators you enjoy, visit placecloud.io.
Under a railway bridge on Salmon Lane in the Limehouse area of East London is an inconspicuous piece of graffiti left in large white letters. G. Davies is innocent. The graffiti itself on Salmon Lane doesn't particularly stand out, but it tells a much wider story linked to numerous other graffiti marks and a grassroots campaign to overturn wrongful conviction. It now functions as one of the last remaining signs of this massive public campaign. In 1975, George Davies was sentenced to 20 years in prison for a robbery in Ilford, but he repeatedly protested his innocence. As a result, the phrase "George Davies is innocent, OK" began appearing around the East End of London, where he had grown up, and then went on to appear on motorway bridges such as the M1 and on city buildings and town halls across the country. Some have stated that this was an original viral campaign, as it was written so many times and became so high profile that George Davies went on to become one of the best known prisoners in Britain at the time. Countless badges, banners and t-shirts were also produced at the time with the words "George Davies is innocent, OK." Davies was accused of an armed payroll robbery at the London Electricity Board offices in Ilford, East London, on April 4, 1974, during which a police officer was shot in the leg. Questions later arose about how the evidence to convict Davies had been gathered. The conviction was based solely on unreliable use of identification evidence, and other evidence connecting him to the crime was notably absent. Davies was a minicab driver and claimed to have been driving his cab on the morning of the crime as he delivered a consignment of fish to a restaurant on Chancery Lane, a claim which was supported by a logbook detailing his jobs for the day. Davies had been identified by 5 police officers, including 2 who were sitting outside in an unmarked car, though the officer who had been shot in the leg later retracted his evidence, saying he could not be sure it was definitely Davies that he had seen. Although none of the blood samples found at the scene matched Davies's blood type, he was jailed at the Old Bailey for robbery and wounding with intent to resist arrest. He initially appealed the conviction, but this was turned down, and his sentence was only reduced from 20 to 17 years. Davies was a friend of many gangland figures and even ran his own illegal drinking den in the East End. Yet many, including his wife, Rose Davies, believed he was innocent, and the phrase "George Davies is innocent, OK" began appearing graffitied all across East London. High-profile acts of protest included Davies's friend Peter Chappell driving into the gates of Buckingham Palace whilst proclaiming that Davies was an innocent man, and Chappell was also among those who drove vans into the entranceways of Fleet Street, such as the offices of the Daily Mirror and Daily Telegraph, to attract the attention of the press. Chappell had seen Davies on the day of the robbery and even invited him for breakfast, but Davies declined as he was the only driver on duty at his cab office. On the 19th of August, 1975, the pitch at the Headingley Cricket Ground in Leeds was dug up by some of the supporters of George Davies, including Peter Chappell and Davies's brother-in-law Colin, which then prevented further play in the 3rd Ashes Test match between England and Australia. Chunks of earth had been dug up from the pitch using cutlery stolen from a service station, and the holes were then filled in with oil. When arriving at the stadium, cricket fans were greeted with the message, in whitewash on the walls, "Sorry, it had to be done," and the match was then abandoned, as were England's hopes of a win. Many were outraged by the action, with then editor of the Times newspaper, William Reach Smog, demanding that the culprits face the full effects of the law. However, it was this direct action protest by friends and family of Davies that led to the wider graffiti campaign, proclaiming that George Davies was innocent, OK. Those remanded in prison for the Headingley sabotage, including Chappelle, who was jailed for 18 months, continued to campaign in support of one another within the prison system. Celebrity supporters of the campaign included Roger Daltrey of The who went on stage wearing a t-shirt with George Davies is Innocent on it, whilst the band Sham 69 wrote a song about Davies. The campaign eventually proved successful when the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, asked for a review of the case, and Davies was released under royal prerogative on Jenkins' advice in May 1976. However, this did not mean that Davies was deemed innocent at the time. Even though he was released, his conviction was not overturned. His case became one of the most high-profile and successful campaigns for the release of any prisoner from a British jail in recent memory. His wife, Rose Davies, reportedly felt soon after that the attention and celebrity from the campaign had changed him, as he had become an icon at the time and was viewed by many as the famous George Davies. Only 18 months after his release, Davies was caught red-handed robbing the Bank of Cyprus in Holloway, North London. This caused a lot of embarrassment and betrayal to those that had earlier supported his release, including his wife Rose. George Davies pleaded guilty to the new charges and was subsequently jailed for 15 years, later reduced to 11 on appeal, with no campaign following this conviction, and he and Rose divorced within 6 months. On his release from prison in 1984, Davies was then later imprisoned again for attempting to steal mailbags during the robbery of a mail train in 1987, and pleaded guilty. After being released, he remarried, this time to the daughter of a chief inspector in the police, and he became a driver for a courier company. Davies has said that he felt the original conviction later affected his livelihood, as he's been turned down twice for a London cab licence. Almost 4 decades after being sent to jail for the Ilford robbery, Davies finally had his day in court in 2011 to try to overturn his famous conviction. 36 years after the infamous graffiti first began appearing across the country in support, George Davies finally won his appeal. Lord Justice Hughes, one of the 3 Court of Appeal judges who declared his conviction unsafe, stated, "The fact that he was a known criminal does not affect this question, nor does it make it any less important that his conviction should not be upheld unless it is clear it is safe. But the court was unable to positively exonerate him either." Davies hoped to be able to vindicate many of his friends, family and supporters who had mounted the campaign to free him in the 1970s. He said, "I want to clear my name for the people who believed in me at the time and for all those who were in the campaign, but also for myself so that people know I was telling the truth." The graffiti itself remains on Salmon Lane to this day as a reminder of a perceived injustice that inspired a grassroots movement in the East End of London and across the country in the 1970s. However, for how long this piece of graffiti will survive in the future is anyone's guess.